we are going to do some color grading. This is going to be long form. So sit back, relax. This isn't a quick overview of color grading. We're going to dive deep into how I like to color my footage in Premiere, Adobe Premiere. If you're looking for Final Cut, that's not here. If you're looking for Resolve, look elsewhere. There's plenty of people who talk about how they color in each of these programs, but I thought I would take some time to talk about how I like to do it. Now, this is just my personal opinion. That I am by no means a color expert. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there more talented than me, but we can at least talk about some of the tools that I'm using to maybe shed some light on your own process, see if there's anything that I'm doing right or I'm doing wrong, and then you can kind of learn and figure out what works for your workflow, because everyone does it a little bit different, and I think it's good to understand all the tools and workflow opportunities that are out there, just so you can kind of paint a picture of what's going to work best for you. So again, sit back, relax. This is not going to be quick. This is going to be long, but I'm going to make it hopefully fun and enjoyable, and you'll learn something along the way. I wanted to do this because today Gerald Undone posted an excellent video talking about common log grading mistakes and how to avoid them. He does a lot in Resolve, talks about grading log and what you're looking for, kind of with color charts, and you can kind of look at and reading the graphs to really understand how to grade log and what LUTs are doing, because it isn't an easy just apply contrast and saturation and you're done. It is not that, but his video is very technical. I'm going to try and avoid some of the really technical stuff. I'm going to try not to talk about IRE and 18% gray and that kind of stuff. This will be more of kind of a creative session, as well as some of the practical tools that can be used along the way. But I do really recommend Gerald's video. It's excellent. Go check it out if you want to kind of understand why log isn't the same as some of your regular picture profiles, like linear color and the different color modes on cameras. Really, really good stuff. I should also say that I'm going to be using Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro footage. So if you look up, because I wasn't quite sure if the film mode on the Ursa Mini Pro is actually a log mode. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but at least for preference, you can kind of know what I'm using versus what you're using, because it might be different depending on the type of footage you're playing with, whether it's Sony or Canon or Panasonic. They're all a little bit different. They all have their own different log modes, even have, log 1, 2, 3, various flavors. I'm using Blackmagic, the film mode on the Ursa Mini Pro, which is right here. And I also want to mention, I'm going to be talking about some LUTs. They're from Emotive Color. They have a variety of LUTs for a bunch of different cameras, GH5, GH5S, the Ursa G2, etc. The whole purpose of these LUTs is to match Alexa footage. So we're going to talk about that more in detail later, but just as a frame of reference, you don't necessarily have to get these LUTs, nor do I think you should. I'm not recommending them. I'm just saying for frame of reference, this is where I got them. You can also check out the LUTs from Leeming LUT Pro. Again, a bunch of LUTs, and these are meant more for like matching cameras to kind of standardize everything, because that's an issue a lot of people have on projects where they're using footage from different cameras. That's what these LUTs are for. I'm not going to really play with these very much, but I do want to recommend them as another resource out there as LUTs that are available that are highly recommended. And we are going to talk through some documentation. This isn't super interesting, but I did want to at least have it on standby just as a frame of reference if we need to dive into it and talk about some of this workflow stuff. But again, this is what's boring. I don't really want to get into much of that. I want to spend more time on the creative, practical tools. So with that being said, we can hop into Premiere, and I can show you kind of what I've built, this little sequence of clips from some projects I've worked on recently. And of course, Premiere is going to pinwheel on me right as I'm streaming. But anyway, we're in Premiere, and I've got this set up already, but I'm going to kind of break it down so we can talk through what's happening. And this is the baseline. This is going to be first the kind of technical way to do it with LUTs, specifically with the Ursa footage. But then we're going to get into some of the more fun ways to do it without LUTs, because I find that satisfying as well. So to start with, here's a clip. I like using clips with people in them for skin tone and that kind of reference. I think it's really important when you're doing any kind of color grading to not just look at like a chart or a wall or some grass, like look at skin tone, look at people, because that's what is like the most familiar. It is like the standard of what is supposed to look good. Whenever you talk about cameras and color grading, people always want to talk about skin tones. So I wanted to make sure I pulled some of those clips in here with skin tones so we can look at them. Anyway, I've got these clips in here. They're just on a timeline. Again, this is going to be the kind of the LUT workflow. Now you can see with the Lumetri scopes over here, and again, this is just Premiere. DaVinci Resolve has much more advanced coloring tools, but I know there's a lot of people who do edit and color all in Premiere. In fact, that's how I tend to do it, just for simplicity and ease of use. Every once in a while, I may involve Resolve in my workflow, but usually if I can get the job done in Premiere, I like to stay all in one ecosystem. That way I'm not bouncing around between different applications and complicating the workflow. And then it's a little bit easier to involve other people in it as well. So we have this clip. This is all 4K Ursa Mini Pro footage, shot ProRes. This isn't a RAW workflow. That's something else I wanted to avoid because RAW is a whole another beast in terms of file size and storage and even just potential of what you can do with the footage because it's RAW. There's so much more flexibility there. A lot of people don't have a RAW workflow yet. So this is operating off of ProRes. A little bit better than some of the hybrid cameras out there, but really some of the same principles should apply. Just because I'm using ProRes footage from the Ursa Mini doesn't mean some of this stuff wouldn't apply to, let's say, a GH5, for example, or a Canon, whatever you have, or a Sony, for that matter. It is going to be limited, if it's 8-bit or 10-bit and all that stuff. But again, that's technical stuff. I don't want to get into that. So let's get into it. The recommended process for the emotive LUTs to match kind of the Alexa, because that's kind of the gold standard of beautiful imagery is the Alexa footage. I'm going to walk you through that real quick, and you can kind of see why this may be a little cumbersome for some people and why you may not want to implement, but you at least know how to do it. The first step is to come into your effects, and with your Lumetri, they have like a pre-effect, which is basically to set your baseline exposure. When I'm shooting with the Ursa, almost always I'm about a stop over. It's just more comfortable to monitor on set that way. It's a little bit easier to shoot run and gun if you don't have, color cards, which I do have, and I should mention because it was in the thumbnail. These color cards can be very, very valuable if you're trying to match specific colors, get everything perfectly colored. And set exposure, of course. These, though, you don't always have on hand, and they're not always convenient just to insert into a frame or get before a shot. Sometimes it's a little more run and gun, a little bit more documentary style. You may not have time. You don't have to get these ones. This is the Spider Checker 24, but there's many. There's like the Passport one that opens up that's a little bit smaller. There's some bigger ones. So there are a variety of those, and I do recommend you at least have one so you get familiar and comfortable with using it. But I also understand many times, even on shoots that I'm on, like I'm not pulling out the color checker for every single shot. It's just not always practical and functional. There's a lot of stuff on the internet of like best practices of how you're supposed to do things, and then a real shoot comes up and you realize, oh, all that best practice stuff I'm supposed to be doing isn't really functional on a shoot right now. So knowing it is good, but you don't always put it into practice. Just something to remember. Just because someone says there's a best way to do something doesn't mean you have to always do it that way. Sometimes there's some workarounds that are more efficient. When maybe the sun is setting and you just have to get the shot, are you going to spend time to pull out all your bells and whistles, your light meters and your color checkers while the sun's setting, and you're going to miss the shot you want to get? Probably not. So keep that in mind. Back into Premiere. So I'm typically shooting the Ursa Mini footage one stop over, and I found that, based on this LUT, that's the other thing to remember. With LUTs, they always are expecting a certain input value to get the desired output value. So if you don't shoot them based on the documentation, which I can pull up here, right? You have to read through all this and know like how to shoot it, and because it's expecting certain input values of exposure and whatnot. So if you don't shoot it that way, you're going to run into a little bit of problems if you just put the LUT right on it. So for example, if I just throw a LUT onto this footage, which I can pull in here, and of course I'm streaming, so Premiere decides to be really, really slow while I'm doing this for whatever reason. If this doesn't work out, it may end up not working, but it looks like it's working now. I need to pull this up, and of course it's not going to work for me. In any case, if you were just to, I'm glad I actually did all this work beforehand so that I'm not having these issues. if you do put a LUT straight on the footage, if it's not shot properly the way the LUT is expecting it, it's not going to look that great. So what you need to do instead is you need to put basically a pre-LUT on there. It's going to set the exposure, whether it needs to go up or whether it's going to go down. All this stuff comes standard with most LUT packages if it's a well-made LUT. A lot of LUTs are just kind of the color grading stuff where you put it on there to get a certain look. That's not what this stuff is for. This is meant for actually like transforming your footage from like LUT, from log space to linear space. So it's very precise the order you need to do things in. So basically put a pre-LUT on there to get your kind of baseline exposure, which I have on here. So there's like a pre-LUT, and then you put that on the basic color correction here, the input LUT, and then you do a second lumetri effect. This is how they recommend to do it. You do a second lumetri effect, which is where you actually do your color LUT, which would just match kind of whatever white balance you're using. And then you also need to do under the creative tab. So the basic tab, you do the color light, the LUT, and then under creative, you set your black level as kind of like your post LUT. So there's 3 LUTs involved in this process. There's a pre-LUT, a color LUT, and then a post LUT. That can be a lot, and it has to be in a specific order. I have it set up with an adjustment layer, so when I toggle this on, it works. But to do that per clip or an adjustment layer that affects everything evenly can be a very cumbersome workflow, as well as they recommend to match the Alexa footage to kind of set an optical low pass filter, because the Alexa has one internally on the camera. So to kind of match that, what you can do is you can set another adjustment layer. If you turn that on, you basically set the opacity to 20%, and you can use a Gaussian blur around like 10, 15, or 20, depending on how much of that kind of smoothing you want to do. Essentially, the optical low pass filter is going to blur the image slightly without losing detail. It's not a straight blur, so that's why you're using it as an adjustment layer, and you're turning the opacity down to 20%, just so it's kind of like, it's almost like a little glow, a softening of the image, if you will. And typically, just as one of the things I personally like to do with my color on the Ursa, I will go in and I will add some sharpening to my footage just to give it a little bit more pop. So under the creative section, you can add some sharpness. Of course, you can do this over on the right lumetri panel as well, where it's a little bit more visual. It just depends on where you want to be looking. Do you want to look over here on the right in your kind of color layout, or do you want to be kind of in your more traditional effects and filters tab? You can do it either way. It doesn't really matter. I tend to be more on the right-hand side because it's very visual and easy to kind of see the sliders and what's happening. And you can kind of set your sharpness and whatnot more easily. But that's what we're looking at. So with the kind of baseline LUTs applied, I'm pretty happy with how this looks. If anything, I did bump the initial exposure down a little bit more past one stop. It wasn't 2 stops over, but it was a little bit more than 1. So as it was shot, it was just a tad too much on the bright side for kind of baseline. So I brought that initial exposure down. From here is where you would do all of your color grading, if you want this warmer or cooler, if you want it more saturated or less saturated, or you want to tweak your skin tones or anything like that, because now you've taken it from log space into more of like Rec 709, where you have kind of your full contrast and saturation that you're playing with, and you can go from there. Really watch Gerald's video, because it's important that you understand why you need to do it with LUTs that way to get this baseline, because a log profile isn't an even like kind of 1-to-1 where it's the same throughout. It curves off with the log curve. So watch that video because it's very valuable. But anyway, here's where you would add color to kind of make it a little bit more pretty or stylized, however you would like. Now, one thing I like to do is not actually do it this way. I'm just showing it this way because this is kind of the one methodology for doing it very precise. Now, this is, again, requiring a very specific input to get the desired output. So if it's not shot properly, or you're on a shoot and the footage doesn't really match, it can be more of a challenge, because if you don't have good input, you're going to struggle to get good output. So with the LUT workflow, specifically this style LUT workflow, you really need to make sure everything is going really well. And I've pulled some footage here from some different shoots. So different shoot, different day, totally different thing. Same LUTs are applied because they're just adjustment layers over top of everything. And you can see that, I'll make this a little bit bigger. you can see what we're looking at and how it's, let me pop back to the other sequence, how it's sort of matching, you know, because typically when I'm doing shoots, I'm shooting sort of the same way on each and every one. So as long as I do a good job with that process, the coloring methodology should be the same as well. And we can click through here, see a few more examples of different situations where you can see there's like some color differences here. This is all stuff you would want to fine tune and dial in probably after doing the LUTs, just kind of set a baseline for everything. And again, you don't have to do it with these adjustment layers. You could do it on the clip itself. And I should mention that if you don't know this, you can color with effects on the clip right here, but then you can also put it on the master clip, which would be wherever that clip is referenced, it has the exact same color. Oftentimes I am coloring on the master. However, because color is a very tedious process of order of operations, if you color on the master and then you can color later on the clip, and then those can end up competing with one another, and you might, you know, add too much contrast and you lose information in the blacks or in the whites, and then your color later can end up messing all that up. So you just have to be careful if you're doing it that way, but I do find often if it's a continuous shot that all matches color-wise, you can do it all in the master. That way you're not chasing down multiple effects on the same clip. If that doesn't make sense, maybe I'll do another video about that, but it is something to know that's sort of not always obvious in Premiere, that you can color on the master clip. You can do a lot of stuff on the master clip, so anytime it's referenced, you have the same information displayed. It can be very valuable in certain situations. We're not doing that here. I'm just using adjustment layers for simplicity, and we'll keep going through this footage here. And here's a shot that the white balance is off. It's a little cool. I might want to warm it up a little bit, but you can see how it was shot. Just the film mode on the Ursa Mini Pro. Got beautiful dynamic range as you do with the Ursa Mini. But when we put the LUTs on, you can see that it's a little bit cool compared to what I would want for this shot. So what you can do, and you can do this in a variety of different places, and this is where it gets a little tricky because you have multiple lumetri effects. And if you want to warm it up, are you doing it before all the LUTs? Are you doing it after? I'm going to do it before, just on the clip, so we can see what it does. But if you wanted to warm this up, let's say like 15, maybe 30, and I'm staring at a light now, so I'm going to do my best to at least match the screen. Coloring on a laptop, this is not ideal circumstances for doing color grading, but I'll try and do my best. And then it's like it looks a tad magenta to me. So you can use the temperature and tint sliders to kind of dial in the white balance if it is off for whatever reason, because that's important to get right. Your white balance, it should look good. And maybe that's a little too warm. Maybe something in between there. I don't know. It depends on kind of the mood you want for the shot, right? Color is very subjective. What feelings and emotions are you trying to evoke with the visuals in your sequence? But I definitely like the look of that better than as shot, because as shot, just too cold. Let's warm it up a little bit, even it out, make it look a little nice. Another shot from same kind of sequence, so we can warm that one up. Same way we did the other one, kind of even it out a little bit and get a feel for setting that baseline. And we'll move right along. Another clip from the same shoot. And this one looks like it was probably, you know, that pre-effect of dropping it down by a stop might be a little bit too severe. So we theoretically could play with exposure here and brighten it up a little bit if we wanted to on the clip. But again, you got to be very careful where you're doing these things, because you have this stacking series of filters that, you know, you have your Lumetri pre, your color, and then your final output black levels. So there's a lot of effects going on. And then you have the clip effects, you have master clip effects. When you're doing this type of stuff, it's very easy to lose track of what's where, and then you can be competing where you warm something up and then you decide to change it later and you cool it back off with a different filter or effect, and now you have all these things overlapping, and it's just kind of messy to do it that way, but you can do it. So on this clip, maybe we'll warm this up similarly, warm it up, maybe too much magenta, balance it out a little bit. That's looking pretty nice. Maybe just a little dark, but we could always fix that later with some fine tuning. Same kind of thing, very cool on the white balance, warm it up, and hopefully kind of get a sense that you can kind of see how things are working and playing as we're going through this. Where we have those LUTs in place, to add the contrast. If I turn these off, you're going to see that typical low contrast, low saturation log look. Again, it's Ursa Mini, their film profile. But when we turn that on, get a better sense of kind of what we're working with. And, you know, theoretically, you could really warm it up if that's the look you were going for. I think for most of these situations, I like to set just like a nice even baseline, something that looks decent. That might even be, yeah, something like that. Looks very nice. And again, we have another shot here. You can see how it was shot, just baseline. Now, there's a lot of greenery in here, so we're going to get some green cast and bounce. But in general, again, we're taking log, we're transforming it to linear, so we have nice contrast and saturation, and then we can play around with it from there. So if we said, oh, this is a little too green, you know, maybe we like two on the magenta, and then maybe we want to warm it up just a little bit or something, and we could do something like that. I don't know. It gets down to where it's very subjective and in your personal preference, and you can spend hours on one shot just getting it to perfection. I'm going to go over some of that a little bit more in detail after we're clear away from these LUTs, but I at least wanted to show you what this can do very, very quickly if you're intentionally shooting everything knowing your LUT workflow after the fact. Because if you get it right in camera and on set, the LUTs actually work really, really well and they're very fast. It's when it's not shot properly that the LUTs can be more of a hassle and a challenge. Here's another shot. You can see how it was shot initially. So exposure good, white balance is good. We put the LUT on there, we put the optical low pass filter on there, and we look at them and we say, hey, that looks great. Maybe a little bit more saturation, maybe brighten it up, maybe add a vignette, whatever we want to do to stylize it, but you get the point, hopefully, at this phase. I'm going to pop over and show how I kind of do it without LUTs. And I don't know that I would recommend this for every single camera and every single workflow, but hopefully there's some lessons that can be learned here, specifically as they relate to the Ursa Mini Pro, as well as some of the other Blackmagic cameras, and maybe some things you can incorporate into your own workflow. So we're not going to use LUTs now. We're going to go same series of shots, and I'm going to show you kind of how I like to do it. Again, I'm not an expert by any means of like, you have to do it this way, or this is, you know, pixel perfect, accurate. We could be looking at scopes over here, but in general, a lot of people, they're using footage from a variety of different cameras, variety of different shooters, variety of different types of events. And so you kind of have to get comfortable working with anything, and it's probably not always going to be perfect. If you can make it perfect, by all means, yes, do it the right way. But hopefully some of these tips will help kind of streamline that stuff. Before we get into that, I'm going to bounce over to the chat just to see if anything's going on over there. No, we're good. Perfect. Bouncing back into Premiere. So here's where I want to start. With the Ursa Mini Pro, what I like to do, bring my shadows all the way down and my highlights all the way up. The reason I do that is because you can think of the shadows and highlights in Premiere, in Lumetri, is kind of like an S-curve, more or less. You're not changing your extreme, whites and blacks. Those would be these sliders, so you can see it clearly overexposes, and then your blacks get really crunchy. But in general, your shadows and your highlights can go all the way down, all the way up with the Ursa footage. And typically, that starts to add a nice contrast as like a baseline. Will I always go up to 100 on the highlights? No, not necessarily. Sometimes I'll just go up to 50. Will I always go down to negative 100 on the shadows? No, not always. Sometimes I'll go down to negative 75. But in general, it's about adding contrast as a first line operation with the highlights and shadows under basic correction. Then from there, I would play with my whites, maybe bringing them up just a little bit. Typically, it's maybe like 15, and then my blacks down a little bit, just to add some more contrast, but not lose detail. And maybe we'll pull that down to like negative 50. The reason I like doing this, as opposed to curves or a LUT or any other method, is because I have direct control over the numerical values for replication, and I know the difference between a negative 75 and like negative 77, let's say. If you're working in curves, often like these points are very hard to line up for replication from shot to shot to shot. And if you want to tweak something ever so slightly, one small move, even if you expand the curves and make them gigantic, this is specifically in Premiere, Resolve does a little bit better, but in Premiere, the curves can be very difficult to work with because they're not as precise as I would like them to be. So that's why I started doing this workflow for myself, just for my own sanity, so I could use even numbers, you know, and say, oh, that's at 50. I actually want it at 60. And you know kind of exactly what that movement is going to be mathematically, rather than just like on a graph moving a point to some other arbitrary point and you're like, I think that's in the right spot, but I don't really know. And if you're trying to match shot to shot, you'd say, well, on the other one it was 50, and on this one I'll make it 50 if it's the mathematical, you know, numbers. But with the curves, you have more fine-tuning precision because it's the curve. You can go wherever you want and you can make the curve look like whatever you want. But it can also be very hard to get it exactly where you want it because it's a visual dot rather than a number. And with the Ursa Mini Pro footage, the highlights and shadows work really well. This may not apply to every single log camera, but definitely give it a try to see if it works for you. So I would start here. And like I said before, color is never done. You could spend hours doing this, but that's at least a good baseline. And then I move into creative. And like I said before, I typically add some sharpening just to kind of make it pop. If we zoom in here to 100%, let's see if it's going to let me, because it's really, really chugging. Apparently it doesn't want me to do that, so we're not going to zoom in, but we can see, trust me, if you zoom in, there's a little bit more detail there when you sharpen it up just ever so slightly. And typically with the 4K Ursa Mini Pro footage, 50 seems to be like a good number, but of course it could be higher or lower depending on the lens you're using and the kind of look you want it to have, but it just helps add a little crisp detail that I kind of like. Then I would come into curves. And this is typically where, again, if I'm shooting on the Ursa Mini Pro, if I'm shooting kind of one stop over, typically, according to like what the camera kind of wants you to do, I typically always like to pull this down a little bit just to set my skin tones kind of where I think they're kind of like nice looking, and always pulling your noise down. Very rarely do you want to shoot something underexposed and then lift it up, because then you're lifting all the noise up with it. So I just come in for the curve, and I do it on the curve as opposed to up here under exposure, because exposure moves the whole image range and you can get some very gray highlights. You can get some really ugly like shadows in there. So I usually only use exposure when I'm dealing with like LUTs, or I'm setting as if my exposure were, you know, something to begin with, one stop under, one stop over. If I'm doing more creative grading and I'm going for a look, I'll use curves to pull the exposure down without moving, you know, my white point or my black point. So I'm still keeping the full contrast of the image. I'm just kind of adjusting and bending the curve. Do I want it brighter and more airy, or do I want it kind of darker and more cinematic? And a lot of times I go for kind of darker and more cinematic. Just tends to be the vibe I like, but it really depends on the project you're working on. So maybe that's a little too dark. Again, I'm looking at a screen with a big bright light behind it, so apologies if it's not quite perfect. So we'll do that, and then this is where I'll also do some of like the white balance optimization. So if the shot is like a little bit too green, or it's too red or too blue, I'll come into my curves as well. And typically, a lot of times, you know, there's just like a tad more green than I'd like, so maybe pull some of that out. And then for this shot, with all these kind of barrels here, I kind of want to warm it up to really sell the kind of warmth of everything. So I'll pull some blue out, and I'll add some red in, minor adjustments, and you know, it's very easy to go overboard with these curves because they're so finicky. And this is why I only like doing it for this step, because it's just one point. Anytime you're messing with curves, if I make a point up here, right, now you're affecting two parts of the image, the highlights and the shadows. So you know, one point in the middle, up or down, do I want to add red, take it out? Do I want to add blue, take it out? Or green, you know, add it or take it away? So that's what I'm doing there. Maybe it's not quite perfect, but I'll keep moving right along. Now I'm going to look at my hue versus saturation. These curves are really, really powerful. If you've never played around with these, you need to. Premiere didn't have these for the longest time. It was always like a feature for Resolve, and then finally they implemented it in I think 2019 Premiere into Lumetri. So what I like to do is, typically in a shot like this, if there's a color that is absent, I'll almost always desaturate it just to get rid of any kind of weird rogue discoloration, color noise, anything like that. So there's like no blue in this shot at all. So I know that I can kind of pull the blue out, which basically putting a point in the middle and pulling it down. Gonna do that. And just to clean up any of those like rogue color elements. Pull it down. And you may not want to go all the way down because that's really going to desaturate it, but just something, you know, down about there just to reduce that. If you had an ocean and you wanted it to be really blue, you would do the inverse and make it, you know, very, very saturated. Essentially, this curve is your hue, and then up or down is your saturation. And then I'll typically, almost always, play around with my hue versus hue, specifically for skin tones. A lot of times people have more discoloration in their skin tone than is, you know, appealing if they're not wearing makeup. That's what makeup's for, it kind of evens all that stuff out and makes it kind of nice. But a lot of people, if you're running gun and they're not wearing makeup, they might have just kind of their natural blemishes and wrinkles and all sorts of stuff in their skin. And just to even that out, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take my reds and I'll move them more towards orange, and I'll take my yellows and move those more towards orange. So basically on this side of the curve, you can pull the reds down just a little bit, and not a lot. Like this is very, very, very sensitive. And then your yellows, they can pull up towards orange just a little bit to kind of even things out. Again, you could be far more precise with this and a little bit better probably dialing it in here. This is why I think curves are really irritating. I'd much rather have like hard numerical values and just to dial it in very, very specifically, but it is what it is and you got to use the tools at hand. So I kind of do just like a little evening out of that, maybe even pull this kind of red magenta a little bit more towards the orange, but not much. Not much at all. And depending on the skin tone, depending on the scene, you can get away with this more. You might have to do less of it, but it's just to kind of make all of the skin tones more of a uniform color rather than having really red spots or more yellow spots. It's just kind of all orangey, fleshy skin tone, which is kind of nice. And then hue versus luma. This is a nice function if you want to draw attention to the skin tone, which typically tends to be a nice little move you can do. So just in the orange, you can make the oranges just a little bit brighter, which you can really see how much like that affects if I go extreme with it, right? But if I just do a little bit of a pop, it's basically kind of just like brightening up the skin tone so the viewer's attention is more in that area, which can be nice and a helpful little thing to guide where you want people to look in the scene. In a scene like this, where there's a lot of orange and earth tone type colors, it's not as drastic of an effect, but if you're doing, you know, kind of your typical Hollywood teal and orange color theory, you can do far more of it, and it can be more effective. And then likewise, you could always pull, like if you had blue in there and you want it to be a little darker, you could pull that down. So the same applies to up here for hue versus hue. You can always make blue more of a certain type of blue, or, you know, take your greens and make them more green or less green, more yellow. It depends on the effect you're going for. But with these curves, Premiere has become a lot more powerful in terms of color grading capability. Now, under luma versus saturation, the left side is kind of your dark luma, the dark parts of the image, and then the right side is your brighter areas. And then up and down is the saturation. Well, typically what can end up looking rather nice is the brighter areas being kind of less saturated. So if you have like a wall that's very bright, but it's slightly like off shade of yellow or beige, and you just kind of want it like a white wall, you can pull that down. So you can see really drastic if I do this, like it looks ridiculous, but all the bright parts of the image have lost their saturation and all the dark parts have a lot more saturation. At an extreme, it's quite ugly and cartoony, but in moderation, it can be a very effective way, again, just to kind of shape your image and give it more of that like cinematic, where the highlights are just like a clean, white, bright neutral, rather than, you know, sometimes highlights get kind of muddy and yellow or blue, depending on the types of lights you're using and what the scene is, if you have any kind of color cast. And then finally, we have saturation versus saturation, which this is, as it says, you have saturation. So left side is kind of your low saturation, and then the right side is your high saturation. And you can pull that down so that if, you know, parts of your image that are super, super saturated are getting to the point where they're like crazy cartoon colors, you can on the right side pull those down. So that would be taking stuff that's really saturated and pulling it down. And then stuff that's less saturated, you're like, ooh, I want to even this out. So you can pull that stuff up. And again, that's kind of these similar curves right here between the luma versus saturation and saturation versus saturation can be the right, nice little flow that you would want for your image depending on how you're capturing it. And then I'll usually come down here into vignette and I'll add, a slight vignette like 0.5 or something. Maybe that's a little aggressive, maybe 0.3 for this shot. It depends on what you're filming, if it's a wide, if it's a close-up. Let's do negative 0.3 just to add some vignette there to the corners and draw, again, our viewer's attention towards the middle. So here's what we did on just that quick pass. If I go to my effects and I just toggle the Lumetri off and on, you can kind of see what we're working with. And then comparatively, if we go back over to the LUT version of this shot, which my keyboard shortcuts aren't working, you can see that image, which to me, I actually almost kind of prefer this one, again, with a little bit more fine tuning and dialing in, because I get very precise and particular about exactly those curves and where those dots are lining up. But in general, I kind of like this look compared to just the standard LUT. Either way, you could get to the desired effect, but you may be doing a lot more work with the LUT in this particular situation to get to this point. And the reason for that, Gerald talks about in his video about using curves to kind of mitigate the way that log stores information. And that can be valuable for certain situations where you want the maximum dynamic range and you don't want anything to look too weird, to make sure that it's exactly accurate. But a lot of times with color, it's more about like the style and the feeling. And so if you are using a LUT workflow and you're not getting the desired effect, I would say try something different and try both to see which one works for you in different situations. Sometimes some shots may benefit from just a strict kind of LUT process, and other times it might be more beneficial to your shot in the final product going through something more custom and dialed in, even though it's not quite technically as accurate or the right way to do it. I still find these tools in Premiere to be very, very valuable. And then of course we can always check our scopes and see, if we need to brighten it up overall, if it's too dark. We can always add saturation if we go look at our vector scope. But in general, I might add some more saturation to this just overall to bring that up. And it looks a little green to my eye here, and I might tweak some of those colors, maybe even make it a little bit darker. I just tend to kind of like that look of it kind of being a little bit moodier. And then let's go back into our curves, and I'm going to play with these a little bit more aggressively, the luma versus saturation, and because you can see like it gets really crazy there, but I'll clean up some of the highlights a little bit and pull those down just a little bit more, neutralize it ever so slightly in those highlights. Because typically it's like the specular type stuff, which you kind of just want nice and clean. So anyway, that's one shot. And you could do this for all of these shots. In fact, if we apply the same kind of way we did the LUTs, we could use this specific look that we've dialed in here for this other footage and apply it there. And we see, okay, maybe this is a little dark, but in general, I kind of like where the color landed on that. So we know that that was just on this curve that we brought the exposure down. So maybe we do something like that, and we're in a really good kind of baseline spot. Again, same way that you'd be working with LUTs, but we have kind of more of this like custom color at the same time we're correcting for log. This is why I really like the Blackmagic footage. I'll admit it's not quite as easy to do this with Vlog on the GH5. For whatever reason, the Blackmagic film mode works really well for LUTs, because any LUT should be designed for the profile that it's working with. But I don't know if it's because Blackmagic makes DaVinci Resolve and they're just kind of making a really nice color gradable profile, but it works really, really well. Why? I can't tell you that, but for my purposes and doing it this way, it ends up working out quite nicely. And it's not letting me copy and paste that look for whatever reason. I'm trying to copy this over to another clip. Always seems to be issues when I'm, hey, that copy and pasted just fine. So why didn't this one work when I'm streaming? There we go. A little bit warm maybe for my taste. A little on the warm side. So we can go pull some of the red out. It's those minor adjustments in the curves which can be the most tedious thing. Yeah, something like that looks pretty nice. And again, color, very subjective. It might look nice to me and you might think that looks like garbage, but hopefully there's some stuff in here that you find value in. Same thing here with this shot. So probably could afford to darken this one just a little bit, and I would warm this one up ever so slightly. But the nice thing is we have control over all this stuff, and we know, if you know how it all works, you can really get it to do kind of whatever you want. The main thing that I like using is the highlights and shadows to start with the Ursa Mini footage. It just seems to be a really nice way to add the curve to the image without having to use actual curves, because the moment you have a couple points on there, it can be a really huge pain to make sure each one's perfectly lined up. You start adding a few and then they're all affecting each other. It can be very, very annoying. Definitely the more precise way to do it, and you do get some benefits from using a curve, but just as like a baseline, if you're looking for a quick grade to get something out the door, I definitely like this methodology. And then you can always refine it and go from there. Same thing here. I don't, on this method, with the LUTs I talked about, these temperature and tint sliders, I don't like using them for general color, because if you pull this way over here, it kind of pulls the whole image warm rather than saving, you know, the bright white clouds. They're not white anymore. It's kind of tinted everything. And same if you pull it blue, it pulls the whole image, where the curves still retain their white points at the end. So you can make it a lot, you know, more yellow, but you still have kind of white whites, which can be, I think, a little bit nicer look for a lot of this stuff. If you just tint your whole thing warm, it kind of looks sepia tone, you know, or cool. It looks just like you tinted it as a filter, and I don't think that's really all that pleasing to the eye. I definitely prefer to use curves, because again, you keep your white points where they're supposed to be. If you didn't want the clouds to be white, you could pull your white point down and make your clouds yellow if you wanted, for whatever reason, if that was the look you were going for. But not something I typically do. I'm usually playing with just my midpoint to kind of tweak and color as needed. Now in this one, here's a good example. We have a sky, a nice blue sky. So if we want it to be really blue, we could pop that saturation, and theoretically you could pull your saturation down on the warm tones if you wanted to do that kind of effect. That's where you can play around with it and just have fun. So here, when we did the LUT initially, it had that kind of, it was too cool. It had some magenta in there. I think this looks really nice just with our baseline corrections that we did. You know, the highlights, the shadows, so a little bit of contrast there in the whites and blacks. We're not tweaking the exposure one way or the other. Again, we can look just as this was shot, baseline, and then it's like, okay, we added some contrast, we added some color, some saturation there. But it's looking, I think, in a better spot, to my eye at least, than what the LUT was doing. Because again, the LUT is expecting a certain very precise input rather than something that comes in and you're coloring it based on how you perceive it. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it, but the LUT is looking for specific inputs to generate outputs, rather than something like this that can be a little bit more creative and flexible and practical. Maybe you really like LUTs. That's fine too. So there we go. That's just the settings we had copied and pasted. Again, we could, you know, bump our highlights up more, but typically that's probably too much contrast for my taste. You know, keep those highlights nice and smooth and not too much video, you know, video contrast. We want film contrast. And typically the way this was shot, it's, you know, pulling the shadows down, getting rid of the noise, but not lifting too much of the other stuff up. So we've got that. We could play around with the color here a little bit, the curves here. Maybe it's maybe for some reason we want this one to be brighter, more airy. Then we could go in and pull some more contrast into the shadow areas if we wanted, and do something like that. Just really depends on your personal preference, but I kind of like that look. The only thing for this, being a farmer here, maybe we warm it up a little bit, give it more of a farmland vibe. without it being too red. Maybe something like that. It's going to look different on every screen. That's the other inevitable thing about color, is that everyone's watching it on a different device. Might be a different phone, a tablet, TV, computer. Where people are watching really affects the colors they see and how they see them. You can do the best job in the world on the most accurate, calibrated monitor, and someone's still going to be watching it in an airport on some TV with stock settings, and it's going to look, terrible by your standards. So it's really it's the struggle of anyone who does color and really wants it to look a certain way, is you don't get to decide how everyone gets to view it. Even, you go to, you watch a movie or something, and if your TV settings aren't calibrated right, well, it's going to look not how as it was intended. So there's that shot. We can move on. We have this shot. Which we can apply a copy paste. My computer here is really struggling. That is definitely not what we want that to look like, because we warmed that other one up, far too much for this color. So just take those off and kind of see what we're working with. Maybe it needs a little less green, and the greens themselves are looking a little sad on those green leaves in the background. So we're going to go into the hue and saturation, and we could, of course, overall you could change your white balance to kind of warm it up or cool it off. In this case, we want to cool it off to get rid of some of that yellowness in the foliage there. But again, we could change the hue to be more, see, we're playing with the skin tones. We can clear that out and kind of reset it. So that was already becoming an issue. But if we wanted to focus just on the green, we could come in here and we could make the green more of like a cool green. If this catches up. Here we go. We might have to move this yellow point over. That's an interesting look right there. You can really see like how much you can shift the hue to kind of get certain desired effects. So if you want your greens to be greener, that's certainly something you can do with the hue versus hue. And you could, of course, saturate them more as well. In terms of overall saturation, this shot might need it to kind of make it feel the way we want it to feel. And then finally, okay, paste. And this was really warm from that farmer shot, but maybe that's the look you want to go for. Maybe you really want it kind of golden and amber and nice, which I don't mind in this particular situation. And I would say I'm doing a very broad, just like copy and pasting. I don't normally color that way. This is just for illustrative purposes of like the differences between doing these color steps for the Ursa Mini Pro footage versus the LUTs. The LUTs have their benefit and can look nice, but also you don't have to go out of your way to buy them or use that specific one. They can be valuable if you're struggling and you're having issues with your footage. I know other people complain about some of the Sony log profiles or Canon log or the Panasonic log. Even the Panasonic LUTs, I'm not a huge fan of. That's why I want to do more testing with the GH5 and some of these other LUT kind of packs, the GH Alex ones, these ones from Emotive Color, as well as the Leeming LUT, because I've never been very happy with the Panasonic LUTs that are provided, and it can be really irritating to shoot log and then struggle because you can't find a good LUT for it. Thankfully, the Ursa Mini Pro has such a nice codec and film profile that just coloring it even without a LUT is relatively easy, I would say, from my perspective, as long as you don't make a few mistakes. Those mistakes being, don't use the contrast slider. Contrast is very rudimentary, and it's just contrast overall. It takes everything and pulls it apart or compresses it together. I don't like using the contrast slider. I would much rather dial in just my highlights or just my shadows, pulling those up or down, because to me it's more of that like S curve is like kind of it has a smoothness to it that just contrast doesn't have. And again, I don't typically use temperature, tint, or exposure when I'm coloring this way, just because those are very they pull the whole image rather than retaining those white points at the end of the curve, which oftentimes can get you into trouble. If if you pull this exposure down, all those lights will just turn to gray. You can even see it in the scopes where you don't have highlights anymore. You've pulled everything down, which I like to use the curves more for adjusting exposure. It has other complications associated with it, but they're far less of a problem than the exposure slider can be in this situation. And then saturation, you can go pretty mild with it. You don't have to do too much in this situation. Creative, I very rarely do any of this other vibrance or saturation. It's really if you need it for those certain situations where you want a very, very specific look, in which case you could add a lot and stuff here. But really I just use creative for sharpening. And then curves is where I do most of the fine-tuning color work. So it's almost like I break up, if this is a good way to look at it, I break up my contrast into the basic correction with the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And then I do all my color correction in the hue, saturation curves, and then with the RGB curves. I do technically set the kind of exposure with my kind of master curve here, but in general, I think that is kind of a nice way to think about it, using the basic correction for contrast and then using curves for more of the color saturation, fine-tuning elements. And then very rarely do I use the color wheels and match. That's more for like problem solving. If there's a specific issue in a shot, a color is wrong, there is a color that's causing some issue on the skin tone or in the background, it's the wrong color. You can tweak all that with your color wheels and match, as well as your HSL secondary, where you can mask out certain regions of an image, a certain color, and change that particular color to another one. I find it to be problematic in the sense of the same way that green screening can be in certain situations, where if you're picking it off of like your chroma and you're sampling colors, it can get some problems with like where you see like the edges of pixels and whatnot. I find the curves adjustments to be far smoother and more even because you're not just selecting a certain batch of pixels or a certain color region. You're ramping up and down from that region, so everything follows the curve rather than a set range. You can play with your secondary adjustments and how much they select, but I just find them to be, usually they result in more problems than they're worth, unless there is a specific problem in your image that you're trying to fix that you can't do otherwise. But that's more for like advanced stuff and not something I do baseline. Some people could do it for like skin tone of like brightening up faces and whatnot, but typically I find that just targeting skin tone on the hue versus luma and bringing that up is sufficient in a lot of cases. Again, this isn't like the master class of like the expert color grader and let's do all these nodes in DaVinci Resolve and go crazy and make it perfect and set up masks and tracking and all that stuff. I'm aware that all that exists and it's very valuable for the people who have time to do it and want to put that effort in, if that's what the project requires. However, there are many times where you just want a lot of projects, even if they're lower budget or they're quicker turnarounds, to still look good. And I find this methodology to work really well for the majority of the stuff I work on. Again, it can be a little bit different for Vlog with the GH5 and other cameras, but I do really enjoy color grading the Ursa Mini Pro footage because it just looks so nice. And also remember, one thing that you shouldn't lose track of is most people who watch the final product, they're only going to criticize or have a problem if there is an obvious problem in the image. Most of the time, if there's nothing offensive, and by offensive I mean like something that's obviously a problem, they're going to think it looks good if you did a decent enough job color grading it. It's very rarely that someone's going to look at it and go, ooh, your skin tones could have been 5% brighter or 5% darker. That's much more on like the technical like artist side of things, where like we all might talk that way, but just general audience viewer is probably not going to nitpick that kind of stuff. They're going to notice inconsistencies, like if shots don't match or if skin tones significantly change shot to shot, like brighter or darker. But in general, as long as you don't do anything wrong and nothing's offensive in the shot visually, like hurting their eyes, it's probably like your personal, like what you think looks good isn't really going to matter to the end viewer who's, oh, that should be cooler or warmer. They're just watching the piece of content, assuming that it's well produced. So as long as there's no problems, they're not going to have an issue either. Hopefully that's helpful. I know it's a lot. I know it's not exactly the right way to do it. If you want that, start with Gerald's video. It is really good. It's why I made the lights in the background purple, just out of, you know, just as a little homage to Gerald over there at Gerald Undone. Very valuable video for like the technical side of things, but I want to at least talk about how I sometimes do things in Premiere just for a little bit more of the kind of creative quickness of grading on the fly as it relates to the Ursa Mini Pro. I know not everybody has the camera. People shoot with all sorts of things. I'm sorry if this doesn't work for you. But these tools are in Premiere for a reason, and they are valuable. So maybe if it doesn't work for a log mode, it still can work for other modes, picture profiles on your camera, and just fine tweaking and tuning colors. The curves are very valuable. Even in your basic correction, the highlight shadow, I find those to work really, really well, just straight out of the box in Premiere. So there's a lot of core, simple, quick functionality in Premiere that can work really, really well in a lot of situations. And then if you run into a problem, you can always make it more complicated from there.